Good afternoon, everyone. Start right on time. My name is Mark Ryland. I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture for the Worldwide Public Sector team at Amazon Web Services. And joining me today in this presentation is my colleague, Alan Halakmi. He'll be helping us walk through a very elaborate demo, which we think will illustrate and make real a lot of the concepts we want to talk about, and hopefully make give us a more powerful message for the things we want to talk about. So, welcome to the session. We're talking about IT governance in this session, and in particular, how the AWS cloud enables a much more powerful and rich governance model, giving you a bunch of tools. There's still a lot of work, of course, that has to be done, but the tools that are there and the automation that's available and the transparency that comes from the event streams that we fire at you about all the things going on in your environment will enable you to do things that have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do in traditional infrastructure. So let's start off with a definition. What is IT governance? Well, according to the IT Governance Institute, there actually is such a thing. It is the leadership, organizational structures, and processes that ensure an organization's IT sustains and extends the organization's strategies and objectives. How's that for a definition? Pretty high level, right? Still don't quite know what it is, but we have some feeling for it. So instead of going down to more detail, which I'll do in a minute, let's actually go up a level. Like, where does this fit within an overall corporate or agency environment? Parenthetically, you'll hear, because I work in public sector, you'll hear quite a few government references. This is an area that governments care a lot about, but I think you'll see from the talk it's very, very broadly applicable across enterprise government, anybody who has a lot of concerns about information security. So where does governance sit? Governance sits within an even broader framework. People often talk about governance, risk, and compliance. GRC, and security fits right in there as well, typically. You can think of compliance as the policies that you need to have in place in order to run a safe and sane and manageable environment. And of course, implementation of those policies is critical. Now, a theme you've heard many times from us at this conference is this idea of shared responsibility. When you come to the Amazon cloud and you use our services, we give you a ton of features and capabilities, and we take care of a whole lot of things that you used to have to worry about. So we dramatically reduce the surface area that your compliance, security, governance officials need to be concerned about. But within the area that remains, you still have to be on top of it. You have to use the tools we provide to do a good job. And we'll talk a lot about the tooling and how we can help you in that regard. But it is still something that you have to be very, focused on and responsible for. So at a high level then, governance is the category that encompasses all these things and kind of wraps them into a package. And we'll talk about more specifically how you can get at the key issues. So here's the way I like to now, from mid-level principle, higher level framework, let's go down to a little more concretely, what are we talking about when we talk about governance? And I think very good way to think about that is to think about certain questions that you need to answer, that your organization needs to answer, and that those who are responsible for a safe and sane infrastructure or application set, you have to be able to answer this series of questions. And so really, for the rest of the talk, we'll be kind of going through these questions and trying to talk about how you answer them in the cloud environment. So what are those questions? Question number one, what do I have? Turns out this is really, really, really important. If you look at any list of top 20 security controls from any of the security institutes, number one and number two and sometimes number three is all about inventory. What do you have? If you don't know what you have, you cannot secure it, you cannot govern it, you can't do anything. You're blind. So that's a really key question. What do I have? Another important governance question, how is it performing? Visibility into that and answers to the questions in that space, very important part of governance. Who is controlling it? Who are the people in my organization that have access to it? What can they do? What kind of operations can they carry out? Are they carrying out those operations properly? These are very important governance questions. Another very important part of governance is cost. Now, this is something that maybe historically was really hard to get a handle on, especially to integrate it with other parts of a governance model, because costs are very opaque in traditional infrastructure, between hardware acquisition in year A, and security software you deploy in year B, and then year C, the applications get built. All these things, it's very difficult to have kind of a end-to-end or deep understanding of cost and cost structures. So but it is an important part of governance. You really need to know if you're delivering the services required by your organization at a cost that is acceptable to that organization. And last but surely not least, the security and compliance question is a part of governance as well. And as you'll see from the presentation, we actually spend the majority of our time on this one, because it is so darn important. So I've listed it last, so we kind of attack the details here toward the end of the presentation. Actually, about halfway through, we're going to go into that and spend the rest of the presentation on that topic. Let's start with what do I have? Well, actually, before we get to the question, so again, a little more background. And I've already said this, but I'll keep saying it, I'll repeat it a couple times to drive this message home. We provide you some really key building blocks that enable you to answer these questions in a very effective way. Again, arguably, I'm going to say this several times, better than you've ever been able to answer them before in traditional infrastructure. Now, there's still the question of integration. We're not going to talk a lot about that today because you have existing systems. Those are not going away anytime soon. And so you have to think about all these really awesome, I'm going to argue, capabilities in the cloud environment, but how does that then fit in with my traditional infrastructure so that I have an overall governance strategy? And that is quite important. Between some of the capabilities we provide and certainly a very rich partner ecosystem, we can answer these questions as well, but that integration is still something to be aware of. So let's jump into answers to our questions. First of all, what do I have? And here, as you can imagine, the cloud is a very wonderful environment to answer these questions. There's no hidden infrastructure in a cloud environment. We have a very strong incentive for there to be no hidden infrastructure because we charge you for these things typically, although many of them are free, VPC objects and subnets and so forth, there's no charge. But nevertheless, everything is enumerable through API calls. You need to know what's there so that you can carry out operations on them. So in any API-driven environment, you're going to find very rich insight into inventory, what's out there. Now, of course, it's not a panacea. The API calls don't look inside your virtual machine necessarily, although we'll talk about some services we have now with Inspector that can even do that. So it's not, again, there's some work here and there's some diligence that's required, but in general, you're going to be in a really good position to understand what you have. Not just what you have at any given snapshot moment in time, but with the config service, a historical record of what you have. Think of the config service as a graph database which connects objects into one another so you can traverse from an instance to a security group to a rule to an elastic IP and back. So it's a graph database over a set of properties that are linked that represent real running things in your environment, but also a timeline of those things and a change log of all the changes that occurred in those relationships. So on day one, this elastic IP is associated with this virtual machine. You can traverse the timeline and say, ooh, on day 4, it was associated with this other virtual machine. So now let's say that elastic IP gets deleted. It's gone back into a pool and it's gone away. And then along comes a report of an incident outside your environment where it said, hey, we've got some nasty traffic from this IP address and we think you guys maybe, are responsible for that. And it was 9 days ago. Well, what do? Well, the config database can tell you that 9 days ago, that IP was associated with that instance, and that instance had, this set of properties and so forth, these security groups. So there lots of information there. And by the way, with VPC flow logs, now I can say, oh, that instance and that EIP was associated with that ENI, that elastic network interface or virtual network card. And oh, here's the flow log data from that day, which shows me what the traffic interactions were. I can look at the source IP, destination IP, port, source port, destination port, and number of bytes sent in a continuous stream of data coming from that particular network card, potentially one of hundreds, if not thousands of these virtual network cards, all of them being streamed at you through the VPC log service, which can be aggregated into something like Elasticsearch so that you can actually search and manage these things. So very, very rich environment. using the config service, not to mention the partner ecosystem which builds on this and provides you with a bunch of additional powerful tooling. How is it performing? Next question. Now, again, we have this very nice model, which is all our services and things that you can now add to this through custom metrics, emit their performance information into a central service called CloudWatch. You can access this information in multiple ways. There's a graphical interface, there's a command line interface, there's APIs. And again, the nice thing there is you've got essentially a central service which is collecting data from all these different sources and putting them into a well-organized set of essentially event streams or data streams, metrical data that you can then manage and use. Plus, for every single one of those metrical streams, you can create alerts. So you can integrate the stream of information with a notification service, which allows you to say, when the following conditions occur, then take the following action in terms of an alert or an alarm. Going beyond the infrastructure and CloudWatch, which is gathering information from the services, now let's move up into the user space, shall we say. Let's say you're running virtual machines now, and you say, well, how do they participate in this world? Well, we have the ability through CloudWatch logs for you to run an agent on your virtual machines, which also sends data into this central service. So now you can integrate into a common service your operating system logs, your application logs, and so forth and so on. So there's an integration point there. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, we just last week shipped a new service, which is a managed Elasticsearch service, and that is designed to now be a repository, a destination for these event streams, so that they go into a full-text searching engine, and they get immediately indexed and put into your environment. And there's graphical tools for doing queries and searches and building cool charts and dashboards on top of that. So lots of capabilities, again, through integration and interoperability across all these services. Another useful tool that we provide you is something called Trusted Advisor. Those of you who have business level support or above, there's a kind of rudimentary version for the free tier of support, but a more sophisticated version for business support users. And that provides you with a bunch of interesting and valuable tips and information about your environment, both costing data, security data, availability issues that the system can spot, and so forth. Now, these alerts and knowledge that comes from Trusted Advisor is limited in some respects. Remember, we're sitting as like this container underneath your workloads, and we can see things that are going on. That's interesting, For example, we can see how much CPU a VM is consuming or so forth. And if this, from our perspective, we see a virtual machine that the CPU is like 5% or lower over an extended period of time, that looks wrong to us. It looks like something very inefficient is going on. So we create a cost alert for you. We say, we don't know for sure, but it appears that you're wasting resources. You have a VM that's doing almost nothing, from our perspective. Now, you can suppress that alert, and you can turn around and say, well, you know what? I know, but that's fine. That's what I intend. I want that machine to be there, waiting for some event or whatever, and that's fine. We won't bother you anymore. You can suppress these alerts. Point being, though, that from the perspective of this system that surrounds your environment, we can tell you some interesting and useful information, and we will do that so long as you don't suppress those warnings. So we give you cost-related warnings. We give you security-related warnings. We'll tell you, for example, hey, your security group on this instance has a public IP address, and it's port 22 is open to the world. Doesn't really seem like a best practice. Now, you may turn around and say, hey, that's what I intend, and that's fine, but there are some kind of red flags that we will flag for you. Another example is S3 open bucket, S3 open to the world. My bucket's open to, we'll alert you, hey, your S3 bucket it's readable by the world. And of course, you can turn around and say, that's what I meant to do. I've got a website running out of that bucket. Fine, but we don't know that initially, and so we tell you these things. So Trusted Advisor gives you some really nice capabilities in that regard. So moving from how's it performing to who's controlling it. This is kind of a very quick snapshot of our identity and access management capability, but believe me, I hope you've gone to some talks or will go to some, and I'll recommend some where you can do a deeper dive into our authorization service, which is incredibly powerful, very, very rich, capability, especially on the authorization side. Those of you who work in this space, you know that kind of the two pillars of identity access management is authentication, prove who you are, and then authorization. What rights do you have? What kind of operations can you carry out? Most of the work people do in the industry in this space tends to focus on the authentication side and a little bit of authorization under the guise of group membership or roles or things like that. Very little comprehensive work is done on the authorization side. The world is full of stovepipes, right? There's network ACL models, file system ACL models, there's email ACL models, there's SharePoint ACL models, there's all kinds of ACLs out there controlling authorization. But I challenge you to get a handle on all that and really understand what people are capable of doing in those environments. It's difficult, really, really hard. One of the beauties of this cloud environment is, although there's still applications running on top that may have their own authorization models, and we'll talk about how some ways that can be integrated, at least as far as the cloud infrastructure is concerned, the unification is very complete. So you get a very rich understanding very easily of what exactly people can do in the environment. On the authentication side, for our enterprise customers and government customers, we really recommend that you use federation. Don't import a bunch of identities into our identity system. Instead, create a federated relationship between your directory service and our environment, and then as you come in, we'll bring through some of your claims. We'll know the name of the user, which we'll log and audit. We'll know whether they logged in with a multi-factor authentication token, which you can write conditions on. Point being, though, that you can use identities that you already have, and those will flow through, and then we'll do authorization with our very powerful authorization system. What about cost? Again, cost transparency is one of the really large, big benefits of the cloud. Actually, there was a point I missed on the previous slide that I'll pull up here, which is the importance of the ability to tag objects in our environment. So tagging is a very strategic technology for AWS. Just make a note of that, mental note. It's strategic for the following reasons. It's very, very useful if you can think of this as like you can apply a user property to an object in the environment. Object meaning it's in a database and so forth, but it also means something real that is a functioning part of the system. You can tag those objects, and then the tags can provide two really important and very strongly related capabilities. One is authorization, and the other is billing. So the tags allow you to write policies that say, Joe can access the objects that have tag development team A, and development team A, objects with that tag will show up in your bills as being as the billing data will include the tags flowing through. So you can now do pivot tables and say, development team A is costing me X amount this month. So it's very, very important technology. Now, it's not complete. We have some services that tagging is kind of rolling out across our services, and some of them don't have that feature. But be patient, stay tuned. This is very strategic, and you'll see us taking greater and greater advantage of tagging as a very important technology across these services and therefore in our governance approach to governance. So back to cost, transparency is very, very high here. You get literally 4 times a day, roughly, you'll get updates in your bills. You can enable that through the API or the command line or the console. And that up-to-date data can be either consumed into another system, it can be analyzed by third-party systems, you can build your own analysis, and we provide some reasonably good UI on top of that as well. We have something called Cost Explorer, which allows you to do some basic charting and graphing and alerting on costs. You can actually aggregate multiple accounts into the Cost Explorer, whether it's child and parent billing accounts or just peer accounts. And bottom line being that you can now see exactly what's going on in your environment from a cost perspective. Very much encourage you to focus on this and get your head around cost, because for one thing, it has some significant security benefits. For example, if you see a sudden cost spike, the course of a day, it's like, what's going on? Maybe something's happening that I'm not aware of. So even if some of my other governance techniques are not working, my cost governance will alert me to unusual behavior in my environment. Very, very powerful. You can also set alerts and alarms on all this, and in addition to that, we're extending this kind of benefit from just the pure infrastructure into third-party software as well, because if you buy software through the marketplace, Now you're being billed by the hour. Now you have transparency, and this is a huge win for enterprise and government. We have government customers that one of the primary reasons they want to move to the cloud is to get away from long-term, expensive software licensing. They feel that they have not been, let's just say this, they haven't been well treated by the industry over the last however many decades in these long-term, multi-year, high-end software agreements that sound really good because I'm getting everything, but then I never install and use the stuff. And so actually I ended up paying a lot more than I really wanted to. And by going to a pay-per-use, pay-by-the-drink model, this is revolutionary for them. And the cloud enables this in a very powerful way. So now we get to the meat of our presentation, security and compliance. All that other stuff, super important. This is where we all live and die, right? We're going to live, by the way. We're not going to die. So what about security and compliance? You really need to know what the state of the environment is, what changes are occurring, are the right processes in place to control those changes, and then at any given time, are things configured in a proper state? So there's really two kinds of answers to this question. The first question you might say is, well, what about your part of the shared responsibility model? Amazon, what are you doing? How can I be assured that the claims that you make about how great your stuff is are true? And that's a very reasonable question. The way we can't answer that question is we can't say, oh, test it yourself. Bring your guards in and try to penetrate the perimeters of our data centers and come in and jack into our network and do nasty things. We can't do that. You don't want us to do that. You don't want our 1 million customers in our environment doing that to your workloads, right? So that's off the table. But it's also unreasonable for us to say, oh, trust us. We're a vendor. You've worked with vendors, right? They're trustworthy. Just trust us. Everything's fine. So the way through the horns of that dilemma is through third-party auditing and compliance. So we are under the knife, the surgeon's knife of very tough and very professional auditing teams all the time. The PCI auditing team coming through twice a year, but it's a 3-month cycle, so they're in there 6 months of the year. The FedRAMP team coming through and doing their audits. The ISO 27001 team doing their stuff. The amount of scrutiny of our platform is intense and nothing like you've ever been able to do, or it would make no sense to do effectively on your own infrastructure. But it has a really nice benefit to the customer, because even though there's a lot of overlap in these different compliance regimes, and they have many things that are similar or in common, they also have a certain amount of diversity, and that diversity means a very rich 360-degree view of what's going on in our environment. And then for you, the customer, you have access to these reports, typically under NDA, which I hope you agree makes sense. You don't necessarily want the bad guys to have easy access to reports about the environment. But under NDA, we will be happy to give you the reports and much of the supporting evidence behind this third-party audit regime. So that's how you know that we're doing our side of the shared responsibility model. Now, what about your side? Now we're going to talk about, again, the kind of heart of the presentation is going to be what's going on in your environment, and how can you know that things are going well in terms of governance of your infrastructure. So we give you a bunch of tools and building blocks to do that. I've talked about Trusted Advisor already. That's helping with kind of obvious governance problems, cost overruns, idle resources, things like it'll tell you, hey, we noticed you've got all your instances in one availability zone. Is that really what you want to do? It's probably not the best practice from a reliability standpoint. So it'll give you those kinds of, that kind of information. We have all these very rich data streams which you can enable coming at you with logging information about what's going on at the infrastructure level, which is the CloudTrail data, what's going on inside your EC2 instances, which is CloudWatch logs type of data, what's going on at the intersection of those two with VPC flow logs, so all the network flows, we're sending you that stream of data. Many of the services have their own logging capabilities as well. They give you much richer logs, like for example, S3, if you make a sort of metadata change in S3, like you create a bucket or delete a bucket, or you put a new ACL on a bucket, that type of change will show up in your CloudTrail logs because it's kind of this high-level change of infrastructure. But it's not reasonable for us to put every time there's a put or get, which can be millions of times per minute or more, to have that in CloudTrail. But S3 has its own logging service. So S3 logs will manifest to you, the customer, all that's going on in your environment from a logging, from an API level perspective. So think of it like control plane and data plane. CloudTrail for your control plane operations, S3 logs for data plane operations. Similar things with things like Elastic MapReduce. The CloudTrail will tell you what clusters you're creating, when they were created, who they were created by, et cetera, et cetera. EMR logs will tell you, as the cluster operates, it will emit logs about its own internal operation. Other tools and building blocks I've already talked about from a non-security perspective, but of course super, super important on the security side. CloudTrail, API logs of all that's going on in your infrastructure. This is, by the way, this is just, it's hard to emphasize how profoundly better this is than any of our on-premises infrastructure. Just, it's incredibly difficult to set up a traditional infrastructure environment where you have rich, detailed information of everything going on from virtual machine stop start, okay, you could probably log that, okay, but what about who logged into your switches or routers? What about who changed route tables or rules in a router? That kind of stuff usually just falls on the floor. Not to mention the fact that the authentication authorization is usually its own little bespoke system, right? Somebody's got a yellow sticky with a username and password for a Cisco routers, and they go log in, and nothing to do with your identity. And I'm not saying it's impossible. You can do things like Cisco to Active Directory integration, and I'm sure some people do that, but it's not that common, and certainly not common for things like multi-factor authentication. But by this unified API model, all that's now in a central repository of data, and it's emitted to you through CloudTrail, so super powerful. I've mentioned config and config rules. Config I talked about as this database, a graph database of all your objects and their relationships and how they change over time. What we introduced this week is a new sub-service within config, which is config rules, and this allows you to actually write rules about those changes and react to them, either at a minimum by alerting and at a maximum by actually reverting a change. Say, no, you can't do that, and you can automate that. Amazon Inspector is sort of like config for EC2, in that config rules for EC2. Now you can tell the system, I want this state for my EC2, for this fleet of servers. By the way, you do that by tagging. Remember the importance of tagging. So you tag a bunch of instances and say that's an application, and then you write the rules, the desired rules for that application. And then by running the inspector agent, you're saying, I want these systems to conform to this set of rules, and if they deviate, then take action. At a minimum, tell me. At a maximum, revert the change. Make that thing go away. Or delete that file, or whatever the rule may be. Super powerful for building blocks for security and compliance and this overall governance model. Things like VPC peering, really useful and important. This allows you to set up relationships across VPCs or even across accounts. This will be utilized heavily in our demo and in the next set of concepts we're going to talk about, which is the idea of a central sort of shared services model within a large organization. Service catalog, we'll demo that, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But at the heart of this demo, which we're about to run, is a new initiative that we have called Goldbase. So you've heard of golden images, right? Your blessed virtual machine images. Now you can think of having a blessed cloud environment. The whole thing, the networking, the route tables, all of that can be based on a pre-configured and stamped and blessed environment. So Goldbase, which was launched, I think, yesterday at one of the talks, is literally audited by a third-party auditing association. So Veris Group very kindly worked with us on this project on a volunteer basis, so God bless them, to prove that you could actually audit a CloudFormation template and verify and certify that it is compliant with the FedRAMP compliance standards. With the mapping of controls and the ones that are handled, the ones that are not, all that stuff is now done. So literally there's goal-based environments which you can get access to where an auditor has said, if you launch this, it is FedRAMP compliant. Think about that. That's amazing. We've never been able to do things like that before. So you can access Goldbase by contacting your sales rep or reaching out to me afterwards, whatever. I'd like to make it downloadable, but right now you do need to contact us. And that framework is something that we'll continually build on. And actually the demo, which we're about to show, utilizes goal-based with a couple of enhancements, which we'll check back into the source tree. Alan will go through some of those gory details. So, moving quickly to the heart of the presentation, then I want to set up a kind of best practices mental model for you. When we work with sophisticated customers, there's this constant tension which we as a community need to resolve between, let's call it shadow IT on the one hand and reasonable governance compliance on the other hand. As you all know, if the central control group, if they're too heavy-handed, everyone scurries around them. It just does stuff. That's not really very healthy, right? There really ought to be some governance control. On the other hand, if the central group gets control and just really locks everything down, then all these mission owners are just frustrated. They can't do the work they want to get done. And so how do we again break through this dilemma? And I think what we're going to be talking about is, think about this as a customer shared horizontal responsibility. You have a central team that's in charge of governance, audit, security, all these good things, all these good properties. And they own some of the infrastructure, some of the very basic stuff that they don't want changes made to. So AMI images, some S3 buckets, so forth, logging and auditing features turned on, et cetera. They have rights to look in these other environments and maybe even make some tweaks, but at least read access to all the other environments that the mission owners and the product team owners are moving quickly in. But they don't have overall, like, you can't do this without talking to me, type of control, which is where things really begin to bog down. So you really get the best of both worlds with a model like this. We'll argue, and I think we're seeing this in practice in many of our customers, you get the agility of this sort of mission-driven shadow IT model, and you get the governance and control of a more centralized model by carefully understanding the relationship between these things and having a central team which has a few limits on the mission teams, but mostly lets them run free, as long as they run within a broad set of rules. So concretely, what we're talking about is this idea of like a managed services organization, a central team that provides some of these core shared services. For example, account creation and initial IAM setup. That just makes sense, right? Provision some basic things. Identity management. It doesn't make sense for every mission owner to have a federation endpoint talking to their own account. No, centralize that. Totally makes sense. Some of these are debatable, but some of the core networking in IAM probably should reside in a central team. But don't get too aggressive here, right? Give this some freedom to the people that are doing the work of the organization, or they're going to scurry around you. Golden images make sense. Blessed AMIs with corporate standards for whatever security software, whatever is there, you can have those and you can share those out to other accounts within the organization. And you can write an IAM policy that says you can launch any image you want as long as it's the ones I've blessed. And then these central auditing services, which we'll demonstrate. So let's jump right to the demo, and I'll call Alan up on stage, who put this together with a couple of other colleagues, and have at it.
Good afternoon. So just in terms of context, when we put the demo together, we wanted to create something that showed in, again, kind of a concrete way, how you can take these capabilities that are offered by the AWS platform to enable an on-demand, self-service, kind of agility-driven environment, but still maintain the governance framework that's required for your organization. And so we really have two perspectives in the demo. One is the development team, which they just want to do their work unencumbered by policies and compliance. Get out of the way, let them access the AWS console, give them access to their instances, let them control their application, let them do what they do best and stay clear. On the other hand, we have the corporate entity that does care about compliance, and they want adherence to certain pre-approved, pre-vetted reference architectures. They want visibility, audit, and control of the environment so that they can contain any blast radius impact from an errant data activity or deployment. But they also have the ability to open up, if you will, the aperture so that, again, within kind of these swim lanes, the developers can do what they need to do. So we have a white paper called Automating Governance on AWS. I encourage you to read it. The demo is largely built off of that. And it allows you to again, create this balance between the needs of the organization, the needs of the development team, the thing that I would just note is it also goes into some detail about how to extend the shared security or responsibility model as you introduce something like a managed services organization. So it's not just AWS and the customer, it's AWS and maybe a governing organization and then the end users. So I encourage you to read that white paper. And again, because I won't have time as the demo is running to kind of speak to it, we've taken this AWS gold base asset, and we've taken the cloud formations that are defined in there, and we've added on top of them to really kind of cater to the needs of the demo here and show off really the capabilities that it provides. But just be aware that that is available. So why don't we talk about the architecture of the demo? So we have a managed services organization. They have a governing account. That account's pre-created. There is a common services VPC. And the point of this is to provide shared services. Other accounts, as they're created, will be peered into this account for the purpose of getting access to some centralized tooling like information assurance, compliance and security tooling, which can provide vulnerability assessments, compliance scans. We're also using Active Directory. We have domain controllers that are extended into this shared services model in this common services VPC. And that's using AWS Direct Connect, so we have domain controllers that are set up. From a control and audit perspective, there are two other features of this shared services VPC, this common services environment. One is a proxy that's designed to control and provide deep packet inspection really for outbound data flows from the, if you will, constituent or peered VPCs. And we also have a WAF that is run by the managed services organization to control and to protect inbound traffic, or at least the constituent VPCs from attacks against their infrastructure. So we have that web application firewall. And as part of this activity, that managed services organization is providing to the developer an IP address and says, this is your IP address, and when you build your environment, this is what folks will hit. It'll hit our WAF, and then proceed into your environment. The managed services organization is going to create a S3 bucket for centralized logging of things like S3 access logs, ELB access logs, cloud trail data, AWS config data. So we're going to have a cross-account relationship there for shared logging. And we also use CloudWatch logs with subscription filters and destinations. This was actually built before we had our managed Elasticache service, so you can do a lot of this more directly now. But that all flows into a Kinesis stream. So that's VPC flow logs, application logs from your EC2 instance, cloud trail information, all of that can flow in real time, and then be realized after ingestion through Elasticache into a visualization tool like Kibana. So let's get started. We're going to build on the bottom here a managed services, or I should say a management VPC inside of the developer account. The only purpose of this is to provide identity federation using Active Directory, our AD connector, which is a directory services capability. And then the user is going to build inside of this environment their own self-service environment that is based on an approved reference architecture that's been deployed or made available by the managed services organization using Service Catalog. So 2 notes. 1, Service Catalog, just from an anatomy perspective, so you don't get lost. Service Catalog contains portfolios. Portfolios contain products. Portfolios are where you define permissions and constraints, and products are in a portfolio and can be part of multiple portfolios, which will become important. The second is that there is a lot going on in this demo, and so I encourage you to focus on the high-level concepts, and if you're curious about the mechanics of it, come back to it on YouTube. All right, so as we mentioned, we have this environment. Our video will start here. There we go. The Common Services VPC is pre-built, so the first thing we need to do is enable cross-account capabilities for audit log writing and for CloudWatch logs to kind of accumulate in a common Kinesis stream. I'm actually not going to go through the detail of how to do that. We have great documentation online that provides a wealth of information, including examples on how to allow this cross-account data sharing, and also talks about how you can enable access logs for things like ELB and S3 and so forth. So the first thing we're going to do is create a service catalog portfolio for the administrators to baseline the account, and a second one for the developers to use as they want to launch their applications. So we'll go into service catalog, and we'll create the first portfolio, and this is for the administrators to use. This is going to have the set of items, if you will, the products that allow them to baseline accounts or do other administrative tasks. Creating the portfolio is very simple. You give it a name and a description, and that's it. The portfolio exists. Now, when you create the product is based on a CloudFormation template. So we'll go through the process here of providing some metadata, name, and so forth around the product itself. But ultimately, we're going to be importing a CloudFormation template, in this case, one that's built on top of AWS Goldbase. Now, you might say, hey, as an administrator, I'm just going to execute everything with administrative privileges. Why do I need service catalog? I can just pull CloudFormation templates off of S3 and execute directly. Well, the reason that you shouldn't do that in this case is because you're getting centralized versioning of your templates that administrators should be using. They don't have to go hunt for it. And more importantly, as the versions are incremented, the new version's availability is propagated to all the subordinate accounts. And I'll show you how to apply updates a little bit later on. So we're going to copy the Amazon resource name for this portfolio. We'll need it later when we go into the developer's account. And we're going to add a constraint. So the AWS Goldbase templates, it's very rich as a variety of parameters in CloudFormation. But for the purposes of what I'm doing here, I want to make sure that everything logs to a central S3 bucket that I pre-configured called MSO log. I want to make sure that it's not possible for that to be changed by my administrators by accident. And when we get to the developers, I don't want them to be able to change it either. So here I'm saying that the variable, the parameter in my CloudFormation template, must equal MSO-log. I don't want them to be able to change that. So fair enough, the constraint's been added. Because I'm not going to be executing this product in the context of the MSO account, I have nothing to do here. I don't need to provide permissions, but I do need to share this portfolio out to the developer account. So we'll put in their account ID and share it. So at this point, we've created an administration portfolio. We have a baselining capability in it, and it's been shared to our developer account. So now we actually need to do the same thing for our developers. So we go through a very similar process here. We'll create the portfolio for our developers. Now, the interesting thing is that since this is backed by CloudFormation, CloudFormation executes with the permission set of the calling credential or the calling role or the calling user. That's actually going to be problematic because when I baseline the account, my development user is going to have a restricted role that doesn't allow them to make internet gateways or create VPCs. And so as I'm creating this product in this particular MSO organization's account, that's well and good. We'll add a constraint here in just a moment for the S3 bucket. But I somehow have to square the fact that these CloudFormation templates being made available to developers are going to go create VPCs and do a variety of privileged actions, but the end user, the developer, won't have the permissions to do that. And so we'll see a little bit later on something called a launch constraint, which will allow orthogonal permissions wherein I can provide permissions to my developers to access Service Catalog and provide Service Catalog permissions to take the privileged actions on behalf of the user. So we'll add our constraint here. So again, this is happening in the Managed Services Organization account. We're going to add a constraint in this portfolio, again, against our standard development environment. And it's really a cut and paste. I just want to make sure that all the logs from this particular instantiation or any particular instantiation of this product go to our centralized bucket. So as with the other portfolio in the Managed Services account, the MSO account, there is no execution to be done, so I don't have permissions or groups or roles to assign. But again, I do need to share this portfolio out to the developer's account. So at this point, I've actually done all the work that I'm going to do in the Managed Services Organization account, in that top-level account. And you can see that I have two portfolios that are in existence now, one for my administrators and one for my developers. So that's kind of done. So I've gone off and I've actually created a developer account. You saw the ID. And I created a single role in that account. And that role is an MSO administrator role that allows me to use cross-account access on the console to, if you will, sudo into that other account as an administrator. So I don't need to create any users. I can, from my role account, my role or my identity in the managed services account, use this cross-role association into the developer account. Now I'm going to import my administrative portfolio so that I can baseline this new account. I'll take that Amazon resource name that I copied out when I was configuring it and just paste it in to pull in that portfolio. And I'll have in my portfolio now that product for baselining the developer account. Since I'm an administrator, I have full privileges, I don't have any orthogonal permission questions to deal with. I can add my own role so that it has permissions to see service catalog, again, in this developer account. And I'm ready to execute. Now, I'm going to do the magician, nothing up the sleeves thing, nothing up your sleeves here, and just kind of cycle through and show you whether it's CloudTrail or config, S3 buckets, EC2, IAM. There's nothing that has been configured in this environment. And so when we go through the process of executing in just a moment, I'm leveraging the richness of the CloudFormation templates that are provided by AWS Goldbase with a little bit of additional help for things that I need specifically for this demo to really baseline the account in terms of logging and centralized visibility. So you see, again, nothing in EC2. And the last thing I'm just going to pull up here is just to show that there's nothing in, I believe, S3. And the reason for that is when we get into the demo, I'm actually using centralized buckets, and I just want to show you that they're going to be created dynamically. All right, so let's go back to Service Catalog. I'm going to switch from the administration view of Service Catalog into an end user view. And once I'm in the end user view, I'm actually able to select the product and execute. There's my account baselining template. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. So I'll give the stack a name. We'll call it baseline. And notice that the version that I provided from the high-level managed services organization portfolio that was imported into the developer account is there. You'll see here that my constraint works. I'm going to try and change the bucket name, and I'm unable to proceed. So I'll change it back, and we'll click Next. I can elect to do, provide tags and that kind of thing, but in this case, I'm just going to click through. Now, I mentioned you can propagate updates. Well, if I propagated an update, I could actually just go to this Update Stack button and click that, select the new version, and it would, CloudFormation would execute that update. So the nice thing, again, is from the managed services organization, changes in baselines can be propagated to all accounts that are using this common product. Through coordinated Lambda calls between the developer account and the managed services account, I have a cross-account VPC peering activity that's occurring to allow me to get access to that centralized VPC capability. I'm enabling flow logs, centralized logging of that into Kinesis. And to give you a sense for what's occurred, because that all happened in the span of about 3 minutes. TV show cooking time, like 3 minutes. So you see S3 is set up. We're logging to that central bucket. CloudTrail is set up and logging to that bucket. Config is also set up. Recording's on. It's also going to be sending to that MSO log bucket. Now, there are some other things that happened in that management VPC in the context of our developer account, right? We set up directory services to allow us to do federation kind of a very simple way. And that's, again, happening over that cross-account VPC peering. So in order to get this to work for our developers to log in, I'm going to go over to IAM and just see that I have groups and roles that have been automatically created as part of the baselining template. One of those roles was designed to provide access for my developers. So if I go to my directory services, I can go into my AD connector, and I can establish a URL that's specific for this account that I can give to my developer to log in, their own kind of AWS console for the account. So that's done. I can enable single sign-on, which will allow folks that have AD joined workstations to access the AWS console using that URL without getting a login interrogation, right? They don't have to put their username and password. It'll use that single sign-on capability. And the last step is I need to enable console access for this account using this federation model with AD connector. So I've enabled it, but I need to do one last thing. I have my AD group for developers, and I have my IAM role for developers, and those two things need to get mapped. So I created my developer role as part of this baselining process. There it is. In the next step, I'm going to identify my developer group in my Active Directory. And now those two things are associated. So a developer can now log into the environment. Now there's one last thing that we need to take care of. While it's true the developer can get into the environment, we've done the baselining, that's all done, the developer still can't execute anything. They don't have permissions, right? So we need to do one more thing. We need to import the developer portfolio. But there's an interesting wrinkle. When I do the import, that imported portfolio is read-only. But I need to apply a launch constraint so that when Service Catalog executes, it's doing it as a privileged user on behalf of the developer. So you'll see here I've got a constraint. I can't add constraints. I can't do anything to the imported template, or the imported portfolio, excuse me. So I'm going to create a local portfolio. And remember, products can be members of multiple portfolios. I'll create a local portfolio in the context of this developer account. And then that product that I imported, my standard environment, I'm going to pull that into this new portfolio. Now, that allows me to add data, constraints, permissions to my new portfolio in the account. The interesting thing is the existing constraints from the parent account can't be removed. So I'm able to add constraints, but I can't remove constraints that were part of the imported portfolio. So fair enough. Let's give our developers access to this Service Catalog portfolio. We'll find their role for the dev role. We'll add them in. But I still need to address this issue of the developers not having permissions. So I'm going to add what we call a launch constraint against the standard environment product. And this is going to allow me to say, when a developer comes in and wants to execute this product, they want to launch this stack, you should actually execute as the Service Catalog role that was defined as part of the baselining of the environment. So now the developer, when they make that call, will be constrained in what they can do, but Service Catalog will be able to execute the administrative actions on their behalf. All right, they're in. So we're actually ready to look at this from the perspective of a developer. Now remember, we created that access URL that's specifically for developers to use to access the account. And that was done as part of the federation model we set up with AD Connector. So we'll put that URL in, log into the console. I'm not on a domain joined workstation, so I don't get the benefit of single sign-on, but I will log in as John Q Developer. And I'm into the console. Now, I've been operating as a developer in my own account at home, and I have full access. So my first activity is, and I'm a good steward, I'm going to go set up AWS config and CloudTrail so that the folks that are managing the organizational AWS accounts have that visibility. But I see I don't have access because my developer role doesn't have any administrative permissions in this account. All right, well, put that aside. Let's go set up VPCs, right? The managed services organization talked to me about this WAF that they're setting up that's going to connect with my ELB, but I'd rather just bypass it altogether. That sounds ridiculous. So we'll set up an internet gateway, right? No, can't do that. All right, well, I see there's an existing one. I'll just detach it and put it on my new VPC. I can't do that either. Well, maybe I'll just make my own VPC. My new VPC, and I can't do that. All right, so I give up. I'll use Service Catalog, right? So the developer goes to Service Catalog. Interestingly enough, the developer doesn't have administrative permissions to Service Catalog, and so the only view they have is the end user view, automatically. They see that they can launch a standard environment, and I should note that the standard environment requires that an ELB exist. So when they launch this standard environment, a lot of things are going to happen. VPC flow logging will be turned on, an ELB will be launched and automatically connected with the WAF that's in the central services, that common services VPC. Oh yeah, tried to change the bucket, no luck. And as part of that creation, there are other things that are going to be created as well, including some IAM roles that are required for operating this environment. So there's an S3 bucket that'll be provisioned as part of this template, and that S3 bucket has some pre-staged files. All this is going to be executed on behalf of the developer in that privileged role. And you can see very quickly, I think this takes only about 3 minutes. Again, television, Food Network, timing. Yeah, in about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, the whole environment's launched. Okay, now developers, remember, we're in the get out of my way, let me do my job mode, right? So as a developer, I can now go to EC2. The only constraint I have is that I have to have an ELB, and that ELB connects with the centralized services WAF. Well, that ELB exists, and while this role doesn't have the capability or the permissions to create ELBs or delete ELBs, if I'm the application owner, I should be able to define certain things like the health check, which I can do. That permission is available to me as a developer. So I'm just going to change these values around, save, all good. Now, I'm going to launch a web server just to show that this kind of all works. I can launch an EC2 instance. And as I'm going through the process here, I accidentally select that management VPC, the one where my AD connector lives, right? So that was set up to provide identity federation for this account. I accidentally select that VPC and I go to launch, select my key. No luck. I only have access as a developer to launch into the VPC that I created through Service Catalog. That was a constraint on my IAM role. All right, so let's try this again. Pick our instance type. This time I'll select the correct VPC, right? This is the development VPC. Pick the appropriate subnet. And I'll select the IAM role that was created as part of the stack that the developer executed so that I can access the S3 bucket and pull in my dynamic PHP script so the web server can say, hello world. Identify my key, and we're off. Now, I could have done auto-scaling groups and put a launch configuration, had these things automatically attached to the ELB. But since I did this by hand, and the ELB is a required component of the infrastructure, I need to make this part of the, I need to put this host into the ELB, or this instance into the ELB. So I'll add it in, easy cheesy. I won't show you, but believe me that if the dev user tried to put the Bastion host that was launched as part of this Service Catalog instantiation, if they tried to add that, they wouldn't be able to. Very quickly, that instance becomes available. And I can take that IP address that my managed services organization told me was connecting the WAF to my ELB, plop that in, the web server's there. Now, from the managed services organization perspective, auditability, control, and visibility, all that traffic that I just pushed, what little of it was, just went into my MSO log. Moreover, that MSO organization has centralized visibility of everything that just occurred from a VPC flow perspective across all the managed accounts. So I'm using Kibana here to visualize that. I could drill into this particular account, look at particular flows. That's all available. I could be looking at CloudTrail information off of Kinesis. I could be looking at application event logs off of Kinesis. All of this is now centrally streamed across all of the accounts into the managed services organization Kinesis stream, or you could use Amazon Elasticsearch. Now, one last note. So you've seen the real-time streaming. This is just the Bastion host, right? The developer has the ability to access the AWS console. They can access their instance. They can manipulate their application directly, right? As long as they're inside those swim lanes, they're good. And then I'll just finish by saying the managed services organization also has complete visibility from a logging perspective on S3 logs, ELB access logs, CloudTrail logs, AWS config logs. All that information is centrally available for the MSO organization to analyze as they so choose. So I'll hand it back to Mark while it's clicking away.
Thanks very much, Alan. Appreciate it. So what is the takeaway? You probably can guess this already. Automate, automate, automate. Automation is your friend. Develop these templates. Come up with a strategy here. Create enough freedom in your mission organization so that they don't try to scurry around the controls, but enough control so that your governance model is going to be successful. Use a lot of these features that we talked about. Service catalog was highlighted. CloudFormation underneath a lot of these things. A lot of other tools available we didn't get into, things like Beanstalk for application development and deployment, OpsWorks, Code Deploy, Code Pipeline. These are all tools that you can use for automation in your environment. And always think about the security and compliance as part of this application delivery model. It's not something that's bolted on afterwards. It's not something that's spec'd out in a document before and never thought about after. It's part of the process. It's really key. You can use secure lifecycle management processes for changing these CloudFormation templates, right? They become, your infrastructure is code now, and you can apply security practices to code. This is not just a pipe dream. We see this happening. Again, I'll show my government bias. In the Department of Homeland Security, the Citizenship and Immigration Services is doing 2 and 3 and 4 deployments per day onto the Amazon cloud using these kinds of principles. Compliance built right into their CI/CD pipeline. I would encourage you to Google and watch a couple videos by the CIO of that department. He's really insightful, really cutting edge stuff, but he's able to show that he can meet the government's very elaborate compliance and security requirements. He argues very forcefully better than a traditional system can. So these are exciting times for people working in the security governance space. Other upcoming sessions that you might want to take a look at, we'll just put a few up on the screen for you to check out. Some of these, kind of in the same themes are drilling down on some of the technologies we've been talking about. There's also a session that I think went on just now, but was repeated tomorrow morning. It's ISM206. It's about Amazon.com moving to workspaces. And I was talking to the folks doing this presentation yesterday, and they said, hey, we're using all these same techniques in our deployment of Amazon workspaces to the Amazon.com intranet. So that is a very practical, kind of hands-on guide to some of these same things in a real-world environment. So in short, that's automation is the key. Thank you very much for your time.